Okay, so we've set up our Django project and it works locally. Now we want to start modifying it so that we can deploy it. The first thing that we should pay attention to are our Django settings, which you can find in your root, or I guess main Django app, which in this case is called tut, in the settings.py file. And the three most important settings that we're going to look at are the secret key, the debug setting, and the allowed hosts. So I'll just quickly explain what all of these do. Secret key is a string, sort of a long string that's used for basically some security things. And I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. That's just sort of all you need to know, that it is a key. It's used by Django to do some important stuff, and it's got secret in the name, which sort of suggests that you shouldn't let anyone else know about it. Now, you might think, well, the secret key is just a string in my code, and so only I know about it. But often when doing development, you might be putting your code on GitHub or sharing it with other people, in which case you don't want them to see this secret key. So this is a bad idea, and we're going to fix this. We've actually already seen why having debug equals true in production is a bad idea. Debug basically turns on a bunch of Django features which help make development easier. Like when you get an error message, you get a nice web page telling you what's happening with the error. This isn't something that we want turned on in production, for example, because it allows potential hackers to learn about our app and leaks information that we don't want them to see. Finally, allowed hosts is another security thing. Surprise, surprise. It essentially is a whitelist, which means it's a list of host names which Django approves of. So when a user, for example, if we type in mysite.com, in production, when we run with debug equals false, Django will look where the I think it's like the host name header or something of the request coming in. And if the request isn't coming from mysite.com, which we assume is the name of your website, then it will block the request. And we'll see this in action later. So it's important we configure these three things for production. In addition to these settings, typically you just find that you might have slightly different settings between production and development. And you sort of want to keep this as minimal as possible, but you still will have some differences. And the way I like to handle that personally is as follows. I like to have a separate a separate file for my dev and prod settings, and I like to have a base file which defines the common settings. Other people will handle this slightly differently, but that's the way we're going to do it here. So what we're going to do is create a new folder and call it settings. And then we're going to create a file called base.py. And we're just going to take all of our settings and copy, cut, just paste them in. There you go. And then settings.py, we're just going to get rid of that. Yeah, PyCache, gross. Wish it would go away. I'll just ignore that for now. Cool, so we've got our base settings file, and then we want to make our dev specific file, dev.py, and we want to make our production specific file, which I will call prod.py. And this is kind of nice too, because you often have many different environments. You might have dev, prod, test. In industry, you might have something called UAT. You might have staging. And so although you want to keep them all pretty similar, there will be differences, and these files are a good place to explicitly note what those differences are. So just for starters, let's say in dev that from .base we want to import everything. This star import syntax in Python is usually a terrible idea, but in this case, we sort of know what we're doing, nothing too complicated is happening, and I'm happy to make an exception here. All we're doing is we're just dragging in everything from base.py as if it was written in this file. And we're going to remove from base file these three settings, and we'll just paste them in dev.py. Right, so now we know that these settings of debug true, secret key equals a key that's publicly available if it's on GitHub, and an empty allowed host list are all just dev-only settings. And in prod, we will set them differently. So in prod, we're going to say that the secret key is both. So we're going to say that the secret key in prod is set by an environment variable called Django secret key. And we will get into this in a bit more detail later. Debug will be false, and allowed host will be a list of basically addresses or sort of domain names that people can use to address our app. So people, if they're looking at localhost, they'll be able to get to our app, and we'll put our IP address in as well. So whatever your IP address is for your server, put that in. Mine is 64.225.23.131. Cool. And that's our production settings. And so I like this setup because you can see the difference between prod and dev. It's pretty obvious. And finally, because by default Django will just import from the settings module, it won't know how to find these files. We need to put an init file in the module, and then from .dev import everything. So we're just dragging all of our dev settings into settings by default. So if we want to use the prod settings, we need to be a bit more explicit about that. So we haven't really changed anything yet. This all works the same. Previously, when we were running Django, it would go look for the settings module in Qt, and it would just use that. And you can see now that the settings module by default will look at init, it'll look at dev. Dev will have all of the sort of deployment settings that it had originally, and then it'll just use the base settings as well. So sort of nothing super special has happened here yet. Cool, so there's one tool I want to show you, which is kind of cool, that comes with Django when it comes to settings and stuff. Oh, run server didn't like that. Okay, I'll just get this out of the way. Excuse me. Some technical issues. Okay, so we're in Qt, and we want to run Python manage py check -- deploy, and this is basically asking Django. They've got some pre-configured deployment checks that they will run over our app. We run it, and they've got a bunch of security warnings. Now, I guess ideally you would have no warnings, but I think depending on sort of what your setup is and what your goals are, you don't have to get rid of all of these. So if we go through them, there's something about SSL, which is a type of a sort of encryption that we have over our requests, and we're not doing that yet. So we're going to ignore this one. We're going to ignore this one because it's SSL related. This has SSL stuff. SSL, right, debug set to true. So it says you should not have debug set to true in deployment, which is true, we shouldn't, and it's picked that up. Allowed hosts must not be empty in deployment. That's also true, and it's picked that up. And another sort of security thing. So most of these right now are not super relevant to us, but you can see this tool does pick up some of the issues that we want to address before we deploy. I don't really use it, but maybe you want to use it. Cool. So let's now try out our new settings. Now, before we do that, I need to, I guess, give you a crash course on environment variables. Because the question is, how do we tell Django to use one set of settings or another? How in prod are we going to tell Django to use the prod settings when by default it only uses the dev settings? And we're going to do that by using environment variables, which are just a kind of variable that you can set in your terminal, which then can be picked up by the program that you're running. So I think the best way to show you this is just to use an example. So I am going to first in PowerShell set an environment variable, and the way you set an envar in PowerShell is with $env colon and then the name of your variable, like myvar, we'll just call it that, equals the string. Oh, no, this is cool. Right, and then we can print it to the screen. This is cool. Now we want to take this environment variable, which is kind of floating around in the environment, and get it into our Python program. And the way we do that, if we go into counter, now views, it's just one like random example. You probably never do this. So we're going to import OS, the operating system package, and we're just going to override count with os.environ, which looks into the environment variables, and what was it, myvar. So this is going to look at the environment variables that are available when we're running our app, and it's going to look for myvar, put it into count, and then it should print it into our HTML template. So let's give that a go. Let's run server. What happened here? Something's gone wrong. In that we have two databases. That's not good. Have I screwed something up in our settings? Yes, actually, this is important. Okay. Oh, dodged a bullet there. So, yeah. If we go here and we look at settings and we look at the way in base that base dir is defined in Django. So basically the way it's working is it finds the file. This is a sort of a thing in Python that defines the file that you're in now, which is base, and that finds the absolute path of the file, which in this case is C uses mat decode, Django deploy, toot settings base. And then to get the base dir, it goes and finds the parent of that file and then the parent of that. And that's how the base dir is defined. So previously, settings was in the same directory as URLs, and it would go up one to toot, and then up one to toot, and then that would be the base dir. And if you recall, we put the SQLite database in the directory above that, which was here. Now that we've put our base directory, or this file, in settings, which is one more file deep, now we've sort of screwed up that whole relative path thing. So all we need to do to fix this is to put in another os.path.dirname, which is sort of a bit of an annoying gotcha. And that is the danger of using relative paths to figure things out, but okay. Whew. All right, that was a bit of a distraction, but that's okay. So we're going to delete this database that just got created because we don't want it. We want to use this one, which is outside of our tutorial project. Cool. So let's try that again. And by the way, if you were wondering how I realized there was an issue, it's because that when I ran run server, it warned me that you have 18 unapplied migrations in this nice red text. And if you recall, we had already run our migrations. So for this to pop up means that something's gone really wrong with our database. And so I kind of remembered that this issue had happened before, and so I went to check it. Anyway, we weren't focusing on this before. We were looking at environment variables. And if you recall, we've updated our view to use some Python code to read in the environment variable called myvar, which is set to this is cool. And we've done that here in counter views. And you can see that we've imported the OS package and used os.environ to read in myvar. And we should see if that works now. So hello world, the count is, this is cool. Right, so what I've shown you now is that you can use environment variables to inject values into your Django app. And this is, in production, how we're going to be setting some values in the app. So it's important to have a play around with it now. So let's cancel that. Okay, and let's get rid of that code because that was sort of hideous. Get rid of that, get rid of that. Okay, instead, what we're going to do is set the environment variables to tell Django what settings to use. So we can set Django settings module, I believe, module equals, and we're going to give this sort of Django.path of tut.settings.dev, for example, and then run server. And so you can see now that we're running Django version 3 point whatever using settings django.settings.dev. And so we don't expect anything to have changed because this is the settings that we were using before. Count 6, count 7, count 8, working nicely. Cool. Now, if we want to use our prod settings, we need to set this environment to django.settings.prod. There you go. Let's run server, and it goes, no good. Key error, Django secret key. Now, if you recall, we set this earlier in our prod settings, and that's why it's failing. So let's go have a look at our settings in the prod settings thing that we set. And we told Django to look for an environment variable called Django secret key. And if you recall, the reason we did that is because this secret key is a secret and we don't want to hard code it into our application. And the thing is that this is like a dictionary, and we're looking for a key in a dictionary that doesn't exist, throwing a key error, which is why this is happening, which is sort of good. We want our application to crash if it doesn't have a secret key. So the way we fix this is we just set this environment variable. And so this is what we're going to do in production as well. We're going to set an environment variable called Django secret key equals, and it's just going to be some long random ass string that's really long and random. So I think they say 50 characters and it should have letters and numbers and symbols or whatever. So there you go. Let's run server. It seems to be working with our prod settings with no issues. And right now I have something to show you. That's a hard reload. What's happened? Our static files aren't working. Do you remember this? Do you remember having this issue where the last thing where it cannot find our static files over the network? And this is a really common problem that a lot of Django devs will run into when trying to deploy their first project. So let's have a look at that again, just quickly. Let's set our settings back to the dev settings and run Django, run Python again. Run server again. So we're using the dev settings, and we will do a hard reload. That's control swirly thing. Works fine. This fave icon thing's sort of a bit of a distraction, but you can see our styles.css file, which is the CSS that we wrote earlier, works great. What happens when we shift from our dev settings, which we just used, to our prod settings? And you can see this working here too. Get styles.css 200. Beautiful. Let's try this now. Prod settings, run server. The app's working. It's using the prod settings. Do a hard reload by looking at the sort of reload icon, holding down Control or Shift and pressing it. No, it didn't work. What happened? Failed to load response data. And we can have a look at the Django console. And we can see at 404, not found. And at this point, you're like, what the fuck? What do you mean not found? It was working before. We didn't change any static file settings here. In prod, we just set debug to false, allowed host, secret key. None of this is like static file stuff. What's gone wrong? So this is what we'll cover in our next video. We will figure out how to fix this issue by using a program called White Noise. And the reason for this happening is because we set debug to false. And let's just verify that. Let's set debug to true and see what happens. works now. So debug to false. Try again. Failure. So we've got to fix this before we deploy our app. And that will be what we do in the next video. One last thing before we finish. I've shown you how to set environment variables in PowerShell using this .env syntax. It's all well and good. That works fine in PowerShell. That's not how you do it in Bash. So I'll just quickly show you the Bash way to do it. So in Bash, it's very similar. The convention is to use all uppercase. So to set an environment variable foo to 1, you just do that. And then you can echo, which is like printing $foo. So you might notice that when you set the variable, you don't use the $sign, but when you reference the variable, you use the $sign. And we can do something like foo equals map is cool, and we can print it. You can also do what's called string interpolation, where I think that foo. Cool, all good. This is a real gotcha, which I want to point out. If you put a space in between, and this is like the most stupid thing ever, but if you put a space there like that, in between the variable or the string or whatever, it's not going to work, and you're just going to be like, what the fuck? So you need to make sure that there are no spaces. Works, and we print it. Very good. One more thing with the environment variables in Bash. In PowerShell, when we set our environment variable and then ran our Django app, the environment variable got injected into the Django app. In Bash, it doesn't work that way. You need to use the export command so that child processes of Bash inherit these environment variables. So this will, in this case, not look any different, but using the export syntax is what allows us to sort of give this environment variable to Django later on. So that's something else to look at. So next video, we will cover how to fix our static files in production.